I bought the house because of the porch. It sagged charmingly on one side, which meant it had the kind of imperfections that made you take your time sitting down. The mailbox was an antique copper thing with a stubborn hinge that required 2 hands and a private apology to open. The yard sloped away from the road like a promise. Room to plant, room to breathe. The deed was clean. The survey was stamped. The county lines were the kind of lines that meant the Willow Creek Homeowners Association's covenants stopped being gospel and became, legally speaking, somebody else's business. Karen saw things differently. She arrived like a petition, formal, politely insistent, and containing a surprising number of signatures. Karen had been the president of the Willow Creek HOA for 9 years, which in small towns is the equivalent of being appointed guardian of taste. She greeted me on my front step the day my porch swing was delivered, as if offering a welcome that included a citation. She had lemon bars in a Tupperware container and a smile that smelled faintly of peroxide and confidence. "Welcome to Willow Glen," she said, as if the name alone conferred the right to measure my curtains. "It's Willow Glen Lane," I corrected, mostly because the survey had been very specific and because I liked precision. She looked at me the exact way a person looks toward a margin note that challenges the main text. She was charming for a while. She pointed out the ideal angle for the swing, so it won't catch the sun and glare into Mrs. Beale's front window, handed me pamphlets about community events, and invited me to the next HOA meeting. It felt neighborly until it didn't. 9 days after I moved in, someone slipped a glossy newsletter under my door. The front page showed identical mailboxes, hedges trimmed to the exact same height, and a photograph of Karen smiling like a mayor at a parade. That photograph was the seal of a set of expectations. "I thought we liked to know who's joining our community," she said during one of her visits, clipboard balanced in an air that suggested inevitability. "We do not belong to the same HOA map," I reminded her, and because I love documents I slid a copy of the survey across my kitchen table. The inked property lines were stubbornly literal. "That's close enough," she said, and her mouth made a tiny, almost invisible hard line. The first wave of the campaign was paperwork, subtly menacing, politely worded letters with phrases like "request for voluntary compliance." Little arrows of grammar pointed to my garden gnome, a rotund, smiling thing whose eyes had been painted to look east, and suggested that its orientation might constitute a visual affront. They even took pictures of my mailbox from a distance, as if placing it on a battlefield map. Each missive contained the gentle thread of fines and the soft shoe of legalese. I replied with copies of my deed and a calm but firm letter suggesting they consult counsel if they intended to treat private property as if it were common ground. Karen's replies were syrupy. "We prefer harmony," she wrote, "and we are confident a neighborly conversation can resolve any concerns." When she said she'd use every method available to maintain standards, she didn't yet mean it literally. But when the message moved from clipboard to flesh, it got noisier. One humid morning my porch swing lay in the driveway like a toppled flag, its chains severed and a staple-pinned note on the wood. "Consider this a warning." There were no prints I could read, and the men who rolled past in pickups left only the sound of engines and a dust smell. The sheriff filed a report and suggested cameras. Milo Hart, the lawyer who smelled faintly of old books and espresso and never missed a comma, arrived the next afternoon with practical things in his hands: a thermos, a patience that looked like cashmere, and a legal pad. "They want the glare," Milo said when he read the HOA letters. "People like that. Shine a light on them and they fold faster than predictions about the weather." Milo wrote a crisp cease and desist. It was the kind of writing that closes the mouth of thunder by pointing out the law's lesser-known but appetite-satisfying habits. He cited county codes and statutes about property and trespass, warned against civil and criminal consequences for seizure or threats of seizure, and reminded them, gently, that the sheriff swore an oath that didn't distinguish nicely between HOA presidents and other citizens. For 3 weeks we basked in the small, satisfying warmth of law behaving itself. The newsletters stopped. Karen texted less. I replaced the chains on the swing with thicker ones and named my tomato plants with the names of saints for luck. Then the rhetoric returned, and heavier. Minutes of meetings were circulated online. Someone had started a petition. Someone else pinned a planning document to a corkboard at the community center that detailed strategic actions to preserve the neighborhood's aesthetics. Men in button-up shirts who liked the sensation of being in charge offered to occupy the property if legal remedies were slow. When a truck pulled up one morning with men who claimed they'd been hired by the HOA to remove unsafe structures, Karen stood up like a general at the front. "We're reclaiming communal property," she announced, as though reclaiming was nothing more than re-tagging things with proper labels. She pointed toward my porch swing and toward the trellis where the climbing rose had started to believe in itself. The men approached as though they had a warrant folded into their hands. I stood between them and the swing because sometimes you have to meet ridiculousness with determined posture. They took a step forward. I said, "Stop. You do not have authority to confiscate private property." The camera Milo had insisted on recorded everything. The driver glanced at it. The deputy, who arrived briskly and wore the economy of a man who sees too many small dramas become big ones, held up his badge. "You need a court order to remove private property," he said, which is a sentence that sounds boring until someone's toolbox contains more than a few hammers. Karen's expression did not melt. Instead, it gathered. "We'll seize you by force if we have to," she said, and the words left her mouth like a sentence someone had practiced in the basement for a performance. The deputy scribbled. That line, caught, recorded, real, changed the whole tenor of the thing. Threats are theatrical until they're documented. Then they are evidence. She filed a countersuit anyway, which was a bold and astonishingly hopeful thing to do. The HOA's lawyer argued that maintenance of communal boundaries provided jurisdiction over things that abutted the association's land. His citations were neat, like a person waving a dictionary in a library. Milo had the patience of someone who has tangled knots into bows. He presented deeds, covenants read against the county recorder's ledger, and case law that unstitched the HOA's argument. He introduced the deputy's log and the camera footage showing men with tools and a clipboard shaped like a weapon. The town smelled like popcorn for 2 weeks. Cameras showed up in unexpected places. Local reporters, neighbors who wanted to see how this would end, and others who saw the whole episode as a morality play where nouns like neighbor and community had to be defined live. Karen flourished the role the attention gave her. She told the news she was protecting property values, that she loved holiday lights, that she had been forced into a corner by a neighbor who had no respect for community standards. Her supporters clapped in PDA tones. Milo liked the judge who took the bench. She was a woman who asked brief, hard questions and whose patience wore a watch. "Show me the language," she said to the HOA's counsel. "And then show me where it says you can seize property by yourselves." They could not. Evidence matters in ways that gossip does not. The judges asked for narrations were precise wheels. She pointed out a covenant addressing common area maintenance, not seizure of private property. The deputy read Karen's quoted threat aloud. The camera footage showed men in polos and an HOA logo as the driver's fingers touched a chainsaw that could be used to cut wood or do wrong by a porch swing. Mrs. Lang's testimony pushed things over the edge. She had handed me a clipping about mailbox standards in the first week, and now, under oath, with a voice that bent into regret, she described the meetings in which fear had been folded into community pride. "We were all afraid of being the odd ones out," she said. "I thought if we were loud enough, we could make things tidy. I didn't know it would get violent." The judge granted the injunction. She called the HOA's actions intimidation and explicit threats that might have crossed into criminal acts. She dismissed their motion for a temporary restraining order against me as baseless and ordered the association to reimburse costs. The law, in its dry, administrative way, breathed out relief. Karen resigned a month later in a letter that read like a scripted concession. She moved her family a little farther away and took up community theater where the director meant the lines to be absolute and the blocking strict. People forgave in degrees. Some neighbors brought over casseroles, some brought awkward compliments, and some simply edged away into other loyalties. The porch swing returned, this time with thicker chains and a little tag that read, "Installed 20, and the year carefully inked." Children made it a landmark. The gnome kept its eastward stare and multiplied by invitation. The climbing rose climbed in increments that felt patient and correct, blooming each year like a small flag declaring resilience. Milo sat with me on the porch on slow evenings and we'd watch the lane breathe. He talked about trivial legal things like they were poems, the cadence of a well-placed injunction, the satisfying symmetry of a citation that closes a case, the way a deputy's meticulous notes can render thunder into evidence. He taught me to find joy in small bureaucratic victories, like the moment a judge uses a phrase that clarifies someone's wrongdoing, and to appreciate the quieter moral victories that are less judicial and more communal, a neighbor who comes with a pie and stays for an hour. Karen sent lemon bars one afternoon. She left them on the stoop with a note signed in small, careful handwriting, "For the neighborhood." It felt like an offering, or perhaps a treaty. I left the box on the railing until neighbors came by, then we split them with the kind of laughter that forgives and remembers. The lesson lay in the quiet after the storm rather than the storm itself. Community is not an enforced uniform. It is an ongoing negotiation between standards and freedom. Threats look powerful until they are recorded and shown under the dull light of law. And when a person says, with the music-soft voice of someone accustomed to being obeyed, "We'll seize you by force if we have to," they've crossed from governance into intimidation. Once that happens, the only remedy that often works is simple: documentation, the law's slow machinery, and neighbors who choose to be honest. Sometimes, on hot evenings when the swing creaked and the rose smelled like summer and the light on the eave caught dew like a row of tiny lamps, I'd watch the lane. People walked dogs that were both stubborn and polite. Kids learned how to ride bikes by falling and standing and choosing to try again. The HOA newsletter continued to exist, rewritten by new hands that seemed to understand that uniformity was a suggestion rather than an execution order. Karen's fervor dimmed into a different life. She performed in plays with the kind of exactness she had once reserved for trash pickup schedules. She sometimes waved when our paths crossed. The old anger, the one that had sounded as if it planned to send muscle to homes and clip chains on evenings when the moon was thin, became a memory. The music of the street changed timbre, less threat, more ordinary decency. A legal victory does not teach people to be kind. It does, however, remind them that there are boundaries other than taste, and that fitting together is usually better done by conversation than by violence. I drank my coffee on the porch and watched the neighborhood, mine, almost because I had fought to keep it, breathe its messy, human breath. The law had done its job. It had turned a threat into an example. The porch swing creaked, and the children's laughter filtered up like light. The climbing rose unfurled another blossom, and for once the morning felt like something we'd earned in increments.